There we go. Everyone, make sure you have your chat window open. We're going to be using that. Great. Great. Okay. Okay, Tom, it's 1 minute after. Shall we get started?
Yeah, looks like it. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Afternoon or morning or evening or middle of the night, wherever you happen to be. Nicest day where I am. We are delighted you're here. Very excited to be here for the next few days with you, off and on over the next 2 weeks. This is a seminar, as a chance for us to have a conversation, we're hoping, for us, for you to hear from us, but also from us, for us to hear from you about a set of issues and ideas that we believe are tremendously important. And whether you end up using a social symbolic work perspective or not, we really hope that this seminar gives you a chance to think about and reflect on and talk about issues of social construction more generally in organizational life. For us, those issues around social construction and agency are really central to both the recent evolution of an organization studies and where we think it should be going. So thank you for your interest, your enthusiasm in this topic, your willingness to either get up early or stay up late. For those of you who are in Europe, we can't thank you as much because you're not really, expending nearly so much effort as the people in California and other places are. So this is, an interesting exercise for us because we had a similar seminar in October of this past year in 2020, but it was all prompted really by a seminar we were going to be having in May of 2020, and then obviously couldn't because of the pandemic. And in a way, it's really turned out incredibly fortunately for us because we've had a chance to interact with, talk with, and talk to a lot more people than we would have otherwise. So, so welcome. We have registrations today from 29 countries. We have people from Israel, from Croatia, from China, from Brazil. For the people in China particularly, it's a pretty brutal time zone. So I hope you have lots of coffee going for you. We're going to do a few things today. First, I just want to introduce ourselves. I'm going to introduce myself and then Nelson will introduce himself. I'm a professor of strategy at the Said Business School in the University of Oxford. My first degree was in business and finance, in fact, but I've recovered from that significantly. Since then, I did my PhD at the University of Alberta about 30 years ago in organizational analysis, as it was called then, with a minor in computer science. And then really what I've done since then for the last 30 years is just tried to observe how people change the world or try to change the world, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, usually in kind of highly contested areas. That the picture above my name isn't really my car. I never had a car that nice when I lived in Edmonton.
Tom, you have to share the slide.
Oh my God. So this will be like the first of 75 times when Nelson says to me, Tom, you're not sharing your screen. So I'd like to say that was all planned just for your amusement, but okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so now you can see a picture of a car and you don't think I'm completely losing my mind. The picture on the right is really my understanding of Edmonton. I grew up there for almost 30 years and haven't looked back. I think we have somebody from Edmonton here now, so my condolences. My family's still there. I go back all the time and I love Alberta. But in any case, I'll turn it to Nelson, who will introduce himself.
Yes, hi everyone. Fantastic to see everyone. As Tom said, the fact that we are doing these seminars is a fortuitous accident, and it's really great that so many of you could join us, and just to have this sort of conversation, much bigger scale than we anticipated. Like Tom, I'm from Alberta, although I'm not from the city, I'm from the country. That picture is not far from where I grew up, with the buffalo in Alberta. I also, I started out not in business, actually. I started out in engineering. I was a computer engineer, and then through a whole sequence of events, discovered people. Ended up doing an MBA and then a PhD at University of Alberta, where I met Tom. And I still spend a lot of time thinking about things like, technology and people, but through all this has been a theme from the beginning, trying to understand where the social world comes from. So this is kind of where Tom and I have been talking about this stuff for a very long time, and where the book comes from. And it's really a real pleasure to be with you guys to continue the conversation that Tom and I have been having amongst ourselves for a very long time. And the summary of that is the book that you've been having a look at. So it's a real treat to be here with you and have a chance to see what you think, get some new ideas from you, and also force us to explain better the places where we still are unclear in terms of what we're proposing as a way to think about this. Okay, Tom, you can change the slide, please. We wanted to just find a little bit out about you guys, what's going on, who's in the room. We have some information on you from when you applied, but we just were curious about who's actually here, and so we created a poll. So I want to just share a poll with you. We did our best to come up with categories that would represent everyone. There's if we missed in the first version of this last time we did it, we forgot Latin America. So let's see what we forgot this time. And I'll share the poll with you. Just answer just a few questions about where you're from, what you are in terms of PhD student or a postdoc or whatever, and then the kind of things you're interested in. Just give us a sense of who's in the room. So I'm going to share that poll with you, and please have a look and answer as best as you can. I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. So there's a few questions. Oh, can you see that, Tom? Oh yeah, there, okay. Just no, I hadn't had any answers yet, so I just was a bit. Good. It's kind of like popcorn. It takes a little while to get going, and then there's a flurry, yes, and then it tails off. Great. Let's leave it for a few more seconds. Still 10 of you to finish. Great. This is okay. Yeah, you can choose more than one in the type of work section if you like.
Oh, no, probably you can't.
You can't? Oh.
Yeah, I meant for it to be able to. I guess I set it up wrong.
So the question is actually, what's your favorite kind of social symbolic work? Okay, I think everyone's finished. Great. That's right, share the results with you. Okay, so what stage are you in your doctoral career? So we have quite a few doctoral students. We have a few postdocs. So advanced doctoral student is the older. We are not
the winning category.
Yes, we mean older in the sense of your academic career, not your life stage. We have no opinion on life stages. So yeah, must put some postdocs and some faculty members. So there's a broad range of different people, and we're going to have you in lots of breakouts. So we'll try to give you a chance to meet as many people. Each time we put you in a breakout, we're going to resort so that you can meet as many of the other people as you. And we'll also later give people who are interested a chance to share your information. And there's already an existing group from the previous seminar, and we'll create an addition to that from this seminar of people who want to carry on the conversation afterwards. So we'll come back to that a little bit later on. What's kind of social symbolic work? Well, this was forced choice. Institutional work, well, you had to say that. Tom's here. I should have made him step out of the room while we did this. But also identity work, that makes sense. The micro people, so we have a bunch of well, it could be organizational identity work or individual identity work. Career work, technology work, yeah, strategy work. No one with category work. That's interesting because that's actually an increasingly active area of research. So yeah, interesting that I don't. Do we have an exercise that involves category work? I don't think so, Tom. Do we?
We
No.
don't. It's interesting. This is you're a more diverse group in terms of the kinds of social symbolic work you primarily identify with than the previous group. So it's nice.
That's
It's great.
yeah, interesting. And then where are we? All over the world. So 13% UK, 39% Europe, 37% North America. So it's, that's the, as Tom said, West Coast people. Impressive. It's not as early as it was in the previous seminar. We moved this to be a little bit later to help North Americans join us. South America, which we remembered to include on this poll, well done us. And a few from Asia and a few from Africa, so that's great. And one from other. What did we miss? Where's the other one? Can you type it into the chat, please? Just so we know what to add to our next version of this thing. Okay, great. Anything you want to add to that, Tom?
No, I think whoever. Oh no, there it is.
Qatar. Oh, okay. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, sorry, Pablo. we don't have anything for the Middle East. Thank you. Yeah, the Gulf for the Middle East. We'll add that one in next time, Pablo. Okay, great. Thank you all, and we'll try to get you to meet as many other people in the group as we can.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to sharing my slides with you.
There we go. Gone.
And tell you a little bit about. We're just going to give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to do over the 4 days before we get into the content. We have a series of aims for this course. The first one is really kind of overview in terms of giving you an understanding of what are the key ideas and the issues in the study of social symbolic work. And so it's both a set of concepts, but also a perspective that has its own kind of view of the world in some ways. And so we're going to try and give you that overview. We're also going to give you opportunities to try and think about what would be new issues or topics or research questions that if you adopted a social symbolic work perspective, either kind of partly or fully, what would that lead to? And I think any perspective that we adopt doesn't just provide sets of answers, it also leads to sets of questions. And so we'll spend time, especially on the last day, but actually all the way through developing research questions. Starting today, one of the first exercises we'll do will be around developing research questions. We want to give you a chance to explore your ideas for the study of social symbolic work. And one of the ways, the main ways we'll do that, it's in the syllabus, but you may not have seen it. On the last day, for the last half of the last day, we're going to have what we're referring to as an idea lab, where you come and you workshop your own ideas around applying a social symbolic work perspective to your own research with your cohort, and then we'll debrief that and look at some of the challenges and opportunities that presents. And the other thing is really just an opportunity to interact with other scholars around the ideas around social symbolic work, but even more generally with people interested in things that you're interested in. I spent 20 years of my career on the west coast of British Columbia in Canada, and I loved both the institutions I was at, University of Victoria and Simon Fraser, but there was nobody that did anything like what I did. And so meetings like this were how I could interact with people who were doing work similar to myself. Now I live outside of London. It's really not nearly so difficult, but I know for lots of you, there won't be a lot of people either in your institution or even necessarily nearby who are doing work very, very similar to yours. And so, as Nelson mentioned, the previous cohort self-organized and has begun a kind of community of practice around social symbolic work, which we'll plug you into, and we'll talk to the organizer who's kind of leading that so you can get networked into that group. It's really self-organizing. We don't have a lot to do with it other than kind of trying to contribute, but you might be interested in that. So this is the structure of the 4 days. Each of those bands is a day, and each of the days has two elements to it, sometimes two topics, sometimes just two different kind of pieces. So today we're going to give you an introduction to social symbolic work, as well as a discussion of self-work. This Thursday, we'll discuss organization work, and we'll also have a guest speaker, Professor Paul Tracy from the University of Cambridge. Next week on Tuesday, we'll discuss institutional work. And then again, we'll have a guest speaker, Professor Charlene Zietsma from Penn State. And then on the last day, week Thursday, we'll discuss theoretical opportunities associated with social symbolic work, and then finish with the Idea Lab, where you will get a chance to kind of apply and explore what those theoretical opportunities might be in relationship to your own research. As Nelson mentioned, keep the chat open if you have questions. Whoever's speaking, Nelson or myself at whatever time, won't be looking at chat very much, but the other person will be monitoring it. So that's your best way to ask questions, okay?
Do you want to mention the readings, Tom?
Whoops, yes. What am I mentioning?
Just that there's readings for some of the.
Oh, yes. So there are readings. So there's a syllabus attached to the confirmation that you got. So if you don't have a syllabus, I'll put the link again into the chat just in case you don't have it. The reading is essentially a combination of chapters of the book, as well as specific readings that allow you to do the exercises that we're going to do each day. And so it's actually would be really helpful to have skimmed the book, but definitely read the readings. The readings are short. There, if you haven't looked at them yet, there are newspaper articles, that kind of thing, that would just allow us to have some kind of collective basis for conversation about the concepts. So they'll provide a kind of empirical foundation that we can have conversations around. Okay. Yeah, actually, I'm just gonna put the link right in the chat now. Actually, I'm not going to. I'll put it in later. Doesn't matter.
Yeah,
Or
well,
maybe.
when I'm talking on the next slide, you can do that.
Okay. Now, so now I'll turn it to you. You can do it.
Yeah. So just the usual stuff that we say. Confidentiality. But we're not going to be talking about much in this seminar that's been very personal. So I guess that one is somewhat less of a topic than in some other seminars that we talk about. We do want you to be fully present, especially in the breakouts. So when Tom and I are talking, we'd love it if you're paying attention completely to us, but particularly when you're in the breakouts, please make sure you're there, you have your camera on, you're interacting with the other people, because their experience really depends on you engaging with them. And so make sure when you're going into the breakouts that you're there, your camera's on, and you're not doing emails or reading a book, right? Do try to make sure, as Tom said, there's some small readings that we need you to do beforehand. Make sure you've read those, because you're going to be talking about them in some of the breakouts and things, and using them as examples, the things that they talk about. They're usually, we think they're relatively interesting, and they have the huge advantage of being very short. We give you the pages in the book, that the chapters in the book for each of the classes. But of course, if you don't read that, we're not going to know. We're not going to have any tests or quizzes, but it'd be nice if you have a look. And we're going to be giving people a lot of feedback, and make sure we're focusing on helping other people and talking to people, not about other people. And yeah, engage with us and get as much out of this as you can. Okay. Yeah, you can tweet. I mean, in confidentiality, and the only, I guess if you're talking about certain projects and things, you might, these things are, people may be sharing with you ideas and things that they are not ready for them to be shared around. So just be thoughtful about what you're sharing. So kind of Chatham House rules. We're just kind of being thoughtful about each other's ideas, where we are, and what we're thinking about when we're sharing things. And yeah, please put everything in the chat. Okay, Tom, can you put me on to the next slide, please? Okay, we're on Zoom. The first time we were doing this, we were still much earlier in the Zoom journey. We kept the slide in, although you're all super Zoom experts. The only one I will say, that the rest, most of these, you'll be super familiar with it. Just quickly check your name and make sure you have the name up that you want us to call you. If it's the name of one of the Mutant Ninja Turtles or one of some sort of Marvel comic character, that's really cool. But if I call you that, it probably won't be ideal. So just make sure the name you have is the name you want to be called. breakouts, polls. We'll be doing as many of those as we can. And you guys were great already on the poll. We're going to be using Jamboard. I hope, if you've not used that before, they're super easy to use, but we're going to be using those extensively to collect together your comments. This is a fairly large group, and Jamboards were great to give us a way to get you to go on, put your group's whatever the task was, the results of that task, on the Jamboard in a sticky. So make sure when you're working in your group, we'll be telling you in your breakout, have somebody, elect a spokesperson, and that spokesperson is going to come and type on the Jamboard. So be prepared for that. But it works pretty well. So hopefully you'll enjoy the Jamboard as part of the process. Okay, Tom.
Great. So welcome everyone again. We're into sort of today now. If you like, we're going to talk about what we're actually going to do today and then get into it. The two pieces we want to talk about today are the social symbolic work perspective in general and self-work as a concept. And so it's interesting, some of you did put career work and emotion work as well as identity work. So I know there are a number of you whose primary focus is self-work, which is terrific. We actually think there's huge potential opportunities in linking across these things, and self-work provides a really nice foundation for our conversation. We'll have a very similar kind of rhythm to most of our sessions, which will go back and forth between our talking a little bit, maybe 15 or 20 minutes about the topic in a kind of slightly lecture-ish format. And then we'll be having exercises, including breakout groups and plenaries and discussion. The discussion with this number will need to kind of occur through the chat and moderated. But in the past, we found it works pretty well. So let me go further. So just before we do that, one last piece we're going to do is actually get you to make a friend. And so this is just, so if nothing else happens today of any value, you made a friend. And so we're going to put you in pairs in breakout rooms for 5 minutes. You're just going to introduce yourselves. And then the key task is to work out one question each of you would like answered during this course. And when you come back, put that question into the chat, and then we'll collect those and try and obviously not address the 140 questions in some systematic way, but try and look at the themes and see what people are most interested in and try and adapt as much as we can to those interests. Okay, so so actually Aoife and Rohini, if you're, or Aoife's there, Rohini is coming. Can you introduce yourselves for just 1 second? Or more than a second.
Yeah, 1 second. Hi, I am Eva. I'm a postdoc, Tom's postdoc, I might say. I'm at SBS as well. And I'll be working in the background, opening the breakout rooms and everything. And I'll be listening closely to what you're saying. And I'm really excited you're here, and it's going to be fun. So enjoy.
And Aoife will be actually assigning the grades at the end of the course for all of you. So.
Oh yeah, of course that. So, make me a friend.
Exactly. Okay, so Aoife, you can put them in breakout rooms for 5 minutes.
Excellent.
Oh. All right.
Okay, is everyone? I think everyone's back, Tom.
Okay, so, and for your questions, if you want to put them into chat, right?
Yeah, just type your questions into the chat, please, because we're going to take them and organize them and make a word cloud and do all kinds of fancy things with your questions. Okay, we can have a look. Oh, okay. So the connection between, Michelle's interested in the connection between social symbolic work and systems thinking. It's interesting. It sounds hard. Okay. Musa asked the question, Tom. Did you see it?
Yeah, what social work is not.
Yeah, we're going to come to that. We have that on a slide. Yes. Yeah, okay. Social symbolic work in empirical data. How do you find social symbolic work? That's a really good question, and we're going to be talking about that towards the end, mostly in the last I think our last class. So some of you have more theoretical questions, some of you have kind of methodological questions, and some of you have kind of questions
Yes.
about what's happening with certain social symbolic objects or certain kinds of work.
A lot of linking questions, kind
A lot of linking
of
questions, which is good.
paradox, knowledge management, other kinds of.
Yeah. Can social symbolic work be unconscious? We're going to talk about that in a second.
We are. Short
I think
answer is
well, I think we need to separate. That's a really good question. We're going to come to that in a minute. And that's sort of, we separate that out by saying social symbolic work, it would necessarily need to be conscious, but it could have very unintended consequences. So people do social symbolic work for a purpose, but they may not actually, the impact they have may not be what they imagined when they started doing it. So that's kind of the way we think about that. Not so much that, because social symbolic work, to be work for us, it needs to be purposeful, which means it needs to be conscious. But we'll come back to this stuff. Great questions. Wow. I think the questions have gotten harder, Tom, harder and bigger.
I think they are harder, actually. We may have to stop halfway.
Paradox. Yeah. How do you work with paradox? Thora asks. That's a good one.
Actually, the one thing to comment on, just in terms of the chat, is we're very happy for the chat, to exist as a very parallel processing conversation that's going on. And so don't be afraid to put comments and questions in the chat. We'll try and pick them up, but equally respond to those questions in chat. Develop that as a good parallel conversation. Okay, I'm going to start to share my screen again, and we're going to push forward. What we're going to do now, we're not ignoring these questions by any stretch. What we'll do is we'll come back to them, but we'll want some time to sort of process them and try and work out what are some of the key themes that we can deal with, and which of those we already have built into the structure of the seminar, which of those we need to adapt to. What I'm going to share now is a set of slides that deal with an overview or provide an overview of the social symbolic work perspective, and give us a chance to kind of get into some of the main key pieces to it. I want to kind of start in some ways with history of the perspective, and kind of come at it from two angles: a history of the perspective in the sense of its evolution as a series of conversations, and its history in terms of our trying to grapple with what it means and how to take it forward. So this is the beginning of the history in terms of the evolution of a set of conversations. And so when we look at social symbolic work, the way we understand it is as an umbrella term that tries to connect and help organize a set of conversations that have been going on for quite a while, at least since the late 1970s. And what you see when you look at this slide is a set of very influential papers, each of which tried to wrestle with a particular object in the world, a particular feature of social life, and the work people did in order to shape, influence that feature of social life. And one of the kind of key ideas that kind of cuts across all these pieces of writing is the idea that we should recognize the malleability, the social malleability of features of social life that we had previously thought of as relatively hard to shape or control or influence. And so if you think about Arlie Hochschild's early work on emotion work and then emotional labor, one of her key points was trying to move away from the idea that when we looked at emotions, these were these kind of uncontrollable, innate, unthought out, unshaped reactions, individual reactions to a person's life. So when we looked at anger, or we look at love, when we look at any emotion, her point was that we shape these things in many ways. We do it consciously, we do it reflexively, we do it for ourselves, but we also do it for other people. And that's when you take that kind of general idea, that cuts through Guerin's work on boundary work and Snow and Anderson's discussion of identity work, the introduction of category work and strategy work, and then our work on institutional work. All of those things we're trying to, it's not that each of them had the same kind of ontological position prior to the introduction of work, but the introduction of the idea of work was meant to emphasize or highlight the possibility of actors intentionally, purposefully, reflexively shaping those objects in social life. So that's a part of the history. A kind of more sort of prosaic part of the history was how we sort of came to it. And so this is actually an email that Nelson sent me with my old email address just about 10 years ago now, actually. And I've edited it out for posterity's sake, but it says, Tom, it seems like forms of work in social theory are exploding. I'm not really sure, but it might be fun to keep track of different forms of work that are popping up. A sort of turn to work certainly seems to be happening, and trying to figure out why it's a good, why is a good way to spend an hour or two chatting in a pub at any case. So that was 10 years ago, and we may or may not possibly should have left it to a couple of hours in a pub, but instead we organized 5 EGOS sub-themes, presented ideas at lots of conferences, wrote a book, wrote a journal article, and literally spent now thousands of hours thinking about, writing about, talking about, trying to work out what is this pattern, both in social life and in social theory. Because for us, I highlighted these different pieces of research on emotion work and boundary work and so on. But for us, there was something in parallel happening in the world that the evolution of work as a perspective was reflecting. Both an evolution of a set of ideas, but also the evolution of a set of practices in the non-academic world. So where we got to was a project which we've now been kind of doing for about 10 years, which has a very possibly vague, possibly grandiose kind of question that animates it, which is how do people purposely shape the social world? And what we're not trying to do in this book and in this set of ideas is answer the question of how do social worlds evolve? That's a much bigger question, and it includes a lot of randomness. It includes a lot of things not addressed within a social symbolic work perspective. The part that we focus on is the work part. How do people purposefully shape the social world? And maybe even more broadly than that, how do people try to purposefully shape the social world and fail and have unintended consequences? And it's really a kind of work-centric, work-focused understanding. Our answer really came down to 2 kind of core ideas, which animate both the book and also animate this discussion in the seminar that we're going to be providing. And the first one is the idea that social worlds are constituted by networks of social symbolic objects. And we'll talk about those in detail, but they emerged because we needed a way to understand what it was that people were working on when they did all these different forms of work. And then the second part of the answer was that the way people shape social worlds, or try to, is by engaging in social symbolic work, we refer to it as, that targets these social symbolic objects and the relationships between them. And so these are really the 2 animating ideas that we will unpack over the next 4 days, and that really structure our understanding of social construction and these different forms of work we'll be talking about. So let's start with objects. So the idea of a social symbolic object is, well, it comes from a discussion that we had when we started to kind of enumerate and organize different forms of work. At the time, we were just calling it forms of work. We were trying to understand, well, how is it that emotions and identities and strategies and institutions can all be similar in some way? What are the commonalities that allow them to be treated theoretically in a consistent way when we look at these different forms of work. And this was a really challenging, and still is a challenging question. And we have, this is, all of the answers we're going to give you are obviously sort of like tentative answers. This is our tentative answer right now, which is that social symbolic works, social symbolic objects, sorry, are combinations of discursive, relational, and material elements. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but essentially means that there aren't discursive objects and relational objects and material objects. All objects, whether it's an emotion, category, a boundary, all of them have a discursive dimension to them. All of them have a relational dimension to them in the sense that they're embedded in relationships which provide the meaning. And so you can immediately see how these dimensions aren't just important in and of themselves, but how they're important in terms of their connections to each other. So discourse is only meaningful in relationships. Relationships depend on discourse to be structured and maintained and so on. And then also, all of these objects, even ideational ones, have a material element to them. They're embedded, if you think about discourse, in talk and in text, which are material, but then different objects have more or less obvious discursive relational material elements. So an example I like is the example of a muffin. Think of a muffin as a social symbolic object, and it's one of my favorite social symbolic objects, actually. And you can immediately understand the material part. So there's a recipe, you bake it. But a muffin is only a muffin in the sense of a food product with meaning in the context of a social milieu that is filled with people and relationship. And it only is a muffin to the extent we can talk about it as a muffin. So we, rather than some unknown, unknowable construct of flour and chocolate chips, becomes a muffin to the extent that we socially construct it as a muffin and know what to do with it. It's also a meaningful pattern. So those are the kind of dimensional elements. The meaningful pattern in the case of a muffin is a simple one. So you think about the muffin has a coherence and a consistency across time and space such that we recognize it as a visual pattern or a tactile pattern or whatever. It has meaning through the discourse and relationships and the materiality that we negotiate its meaning around. And then finally, all of these exist in social systems. So let's talk about one that's not muffins. Let's talk about emotions. We talk about emotion work. So if you think about an emotion like anger as a social symbolic object, then what we're talking about is anger as a culturally legitimate pattern of feeling and expression, not just what you say, but how you feel and what you do, that includes these important bodily elements. And so we don't just mean the concept of, so one of the questions that often comes up is the relationship between institutions and social symbolic objects. And for us, all institutions are social symbolic objects. Not all social symbolic objects are institutions. So for instance, a concrete, I was going to say a concrete muffin, but that wouldn't be a very good muffin. But an actual physical muffin is a social symbolic object from our perspective. So is the idea of a muffin. The idea of a muffin is an institution or a concept, but then we have also physically instantiated objects like the physical muffin. And same with anger. The concept of anger is an object, but so is my anger at a specific point in time that I express. So if you think about Hochschild's work on emotional work and emotional labor, what she was talking about was the work that flight attendants did, not as a concept, but in reality and practice when they were interacting with passengers on a flight. And so those for us are instances of social symbolic objects, their pleasantries, their expression of empathy, etc. Okay. So there's some questions. Yeah. Are there questions we should address, Nelson, before we go on?
Well, I've been answering a couple of them. I've been answering individuals who've sent messages directly to me. I think that they're asking the kind of questions we would expect, and there's a bit of a conversation. I guess the main question is, these questions about what is and what isn't a social symbolic object, and then what is and what isn't work, social symbolic work. So I think you keep going.
Okay.
And we'll come back.
So Those are great questions that hopefully the answers to will emerge. And I think one of the ways they'll emerge is by getting you to actually do some
To
work
do this,
around the
yeah,
concept
that's
of
what
a social symbolic object. And so we're going to give you a game. We love games. Nelson and I love games. We play the games all the time. And we're going to get you to play some games. And the first one we're going to do is a game that is around trying to identify social symbolic objects that have come into existence in your lifetime. And so for Nelson and me, that's a really long time. For some of you, it's not so long yet. But the point is, we're going to give you 10 minutes in a breakout. But first, we're going to give you about 2 minutes just to think about this, because it's useful before you start talking about what constitutes a social symbolic object to, for yourself, think about what would be a set of 3 or 4 objects that have come into your existence in your lifetime, and then you can compare those thoughts with a group that we're going to put you with. We're also going to introduce a technology in this exercise called a Jamboard. And some of you might have used Jamboards, many of you won't have. It's a Google product. We're not getting paid to advertise it, but it's a really useful teaching tool. Ava and I have been using Jamboards a lot in our teaching, and we're going to get you to use those in your breakout groups. So for right now, 1 or 2 minutes right now on your own to make a list of social symbolic objects that have come into existence in your lifetime, and then 8 minutes to share and compare and put those examples on the Jamboard. The slides that we're going to give you for exercises, you don't need to take pictures of, because when we put you into the breakout groups, the links to the Jamboard, on the Jamboard, there'll be the exercise slide there, as well as a separate page in the Jamboard to put your answers. So don't put your answers on the top of the slide in the Jamboard, go to the next page, okay?
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah, so we realized that there are limitations in the Jamboard, but we meant to tell you, and I think Ava broadcasted it over the announcement function, was that Jamboard can have about 60 people into chat, and so not every single person in every breakout room can be using it at the same time.
Yep.
Oh, we didn't see a link to Jamboard. Okay, Ava, can you put the link back in to chat? So John just posted, we didn't see a link. So the chat, the link to Jamboard's back in if you haven't put yours up. Obviously, what we're not going to do is discuss every single one of these post-its. We are going to discuss a few, but actually what we'd like you to do now also is ask in chat the questions that came up for you in doing this exercise. And so there's lots of super interesting objects that you come up with, and there's certainly themes around them. And so, and some of them are interesting. So like, if I look, for instance, at this one, and everyone can see my screen, right?
Yep, that's good.
Thank you. If I look at digital nomad, for instance, that's a good example of a concept that has emerged in our lifetimes. It would also be an example of an identity, both in the sense of a concept as an identity, but also as people who are digital nomads, could also be objects in that sense. If we look at some others, maybe don't come on, but if you think about the body, now, what I'm going to assume is you mean your body, because that obviously did come to existence in your lifetime almost definitionally. But also you can imagine that the body is a complex object in relationship to an individual person. So it can be something that's constructed and reconstructed over time. If we think about money, that makes sense to me, again, as instances of money, but obviously not as money as a concept, which I don't think anyone here is quite old enough to be older than the concept of money, or even older than most monies that exist. Now, there are forms of money, if you like. If you think of Bitcoin as a form of money, then you could imagine that would have evolved in your lifetime. Cryptocurrency, exactly, Stormy Schweitzer says.
Can I talk about something, Tom?
Go ahead.
Because there's a bunch of questions on the same
Yep.
thing. So the two things that a number of you have, asked, a couple of themes that I see coming up. One is, is anything a new social symbolic object, or is everything an evolution of a social symbolic object? This is just a problem we have in social science. When something's new, it's like a boundary. Is there really a boundary there, or is that a boundary? We have to make a call and have an explanation for why something's new versus something that isn't. So one of you said refugee camp. That's an interesting one. Someone I happen to know a little bit about, having done some studies on refugees and the constitution of refugees. So, I mean, it's an interesting one. And I would say that actually refugee, the way we think about it today, came into being. There were, of course, people who were displaced forever. There were people who streamed over borders, or even before borders were very clear, they moved from country to country seeking safety and seeking food, seeking all kinds of things and getting away from problems. That existed forever. But the refugee, the concept of the refugee, really appeared the way we think about it today in 1949 with the UN Convention on the Refugee, right? Which defined what a refugee is, and all of the signatories, all of the countries that signed on to that, agreed that there was this thing called the refugee, and these people had certain rights. And that's what's created the whole system that now surrounds refugee resettlement, refugee camps, and so in that case, we can actually say there's an actual the object, the way we think of it now, and the legal standing that has, that actually has a date, right? There's other ones that are harder to pin down. Another one that we talk about in the book is endangered species, or there's a whole bunch of them that have come into being or appeared and have evolved. Other ones, much more, the evolution is much more gradual, right? That you can't see these kind of boundaries. So there's really good questions. What isn't a social symbolic object? Well, this is an omnibus concept. So everything that we kind of perceive in social reality are all pieces. But if we want to break them up into pieces, social reality into some pieces, the pieces that we identify, that's what we're calling social symbolic objects. Why? Because we're interested in the constitution of social reality. We're interested in the constitution of the social world and the involvement of individuals purposely. So when you think about refugees and refugee camps, there's a bunch of attorneys, NGOs, governments who are all working for and against particular definitions, and legals, and all kinds of stuff went on. Those people were all carrying out social symbolic work, purposely trying to get refugees defined in a particular way or not defined in a particular way. Right? And that's what was interesting, Tom and I.
Right? So let me jump in. There's a couple questions that build on that. What the general question of what is not a social symbolic object, and then Rich also asks around scope, and other people have as well, in terms of what's the sort of relationship between the ontology of an object and the social system in which it exists. And so Nelson's point that when you think about social life, we see social symbolic objects as the building blocks of social life. But that also means that social symbolic objects are not transcendent. They don't exist independent of or beyond social systems. They only exist within social systems, however, whatever social system you're talking about. And so the idea of a refugee, for instance, initially had a relatively bounded existence within specific discourses, within specific social systems, specific courts, and specific adjudications. As more and more people start to use it as a concept and more people claim it as a status, then that object enters a much more complex network of different social systems, overlapping, nested, and so on. But the social symbolic object only exists, their identities, selves, people, muffins, etc., exist within some social system specifically that's bounded in some way. And so going to the question that Rich had around scope. So how does one object change into another? We'll talk about that much more on the last day, because that's a really fundamentally challenging question that actually social science in general has not done a very good job of looking at, particularly in these traditions where what we've been interested in is how a particular emotion gets constructed, how a particular identity gets constructed. And we've done much less work on the relationship between emotions and identities and institutions and other kinds of objects, how they both influence each other, but also how they are transformed into each other, how emotions become institutions, how identities become careers, for instance. And so that those are really hard questions, but really at the kind of cutting edge of what could be done empirically.
And we got lots of great questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to go on or whether you want to talk if they're about questions, and they're all what more of these kind of questions are really good about the, what do we mean? So psychological conditions, they're a great example of social symbolic objects, because for example, eating disorders are very much a Western kind of conceptualization of a particular relationship with food that didn't exist in other places until those ideas moved across and people started having the possibility of having those eating disorders. These are great examples. And also someone asked about things like the belief in not eating beef in India, if you're Hindu. That is for us an institution. So when we talk about institutions, that there's institutions or values, there's lots of kinds of institutions. So those are objects of a different sort. And that's why we have this very general definition of this sort of material, discursive, and relational. And different ones have the different dimensions are more important, but they all social symbolic objects have some of each. Even the most abstract idea has to be stored in brains and books, right? So there's something there. Anyway, Tom, over to you.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, there are great questions. And again, there's something we'll deal with repeatedly, I think, in conversations, is around the relationship between, Teresa's point, around the relationship between social symbolic objects and our lives virtually. And so obviously everyone's much more sensitized than they were a year ago to the nature of online life. Maybe not everyone, but most people are much, much more sensitized to it. And I don't think it's actually problematic at all. I think it's a huge opportunity. And so, things like Zoom waves and other kinds of categories exist that didn't exist, but also the materiality of virtual life is a really important thing not to dismiss. And so it may be a different form of materiality and focus much more on visuality, for instance, but equally important. If anyone has had to kind of suffer through a Teams meeting rather than a Zoom meeting, then they know the kind of limits of the technology and how that affects sort of material life and the kind of objects you can understand and create. Let me push forward a little bit, because this is a seminar on social.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Yeah.
What's really interesting is by the end of the seminar, I hope that many of the things you guys are asking are great research questions, right? They're not theory questions. They're about the world and how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're hoping to provide is a framework for investigating how things are related, how different levels connect, how different objects connect, how activities of actors connect with this system. So they're actually, you're asking a lot of questions which can be reframed quite easily as interesting empirical questions that are really open for empirical research. So anyway, Tom, carry on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good place to stop, because yeah, in a way, almost like any social science concept, you can spend an inordinate amount of time and energy trying to figure out what its boundaries are, which can be useful and interesting, but more often it's more interesting and useful to figure out how to use the concept. And so I think that's really the challenge in terms of the idea of a social symbolic object. The question in some sense is, what does it bring to a conversation? How does it start to help you see things you didn't see? And particularly, how do you see connections you didn't see previously? So let's talk about work. I'm going to share a different screen now. Give me a moment.
You're showing you had the slides there for a second.
Oh, right, I did. Okay. There we go. So let's shift to work from social symbolic objects. And this is where we started from. This is what animates and motivated. Oh, wait, I'm not sharing this. I am sharing. Okay.
Yeah, it's the slide.
Yeah, all good. The kind of animated the work that went around the book and what we're really interested in. Our definition, let me just start there, is purposeful, reflexive efforts of individuals, collective actors, and networks of actors to shape social symbolic objects. On the one hand, this is quite a straightforward definition, but there's a couple of parts of it I think are worth pointing to. One of which is the purposeful. And this is where we begin and end in a sense, because for us, and it goes back to the idea of unconscious or unintentional social symbolic work. And for us, if you think about the metaphor of work, or think about it, the kind of broadest connotations of work and things one works on in one's life. So if you are working on your garden, you don't do it by accident. If you're working on your house, you don't do it by accident. If you go to the gym to work out, you don't do it by accident. Now, I'm a terrible gardener and renovator and exerciser. And so often, even if I try to do all those things, they don't have the intended consequences that I thought they would. But doesn't mean I don't try. And so there's still forms of work despite the consequences they do or don't have. That's the purposeful part. The reflexivity comes into my awareness of what I'm doing. I know I'm doing it. I'm conscious that I'm doing it. And this doesn't mean every moment of every day. This means over a trajectory, I go and work on my garden. So I don't work on my garden every day. In fact, I hardly work on it at all. But when I do, when I go back to it, it's part of the project of working on my garden, even if it's only every few weeks. Okay. And so that's the first part. The second part is individuals, collective actors, and network of actors. This was our catch-all. Like, how do we come up with a phrase that describes just about any kind of collective group? But more importantly, what it allows is the idea that we do work in different ways with different people at different times, and we allow collective actors and networks of actors to have purpose and to have reflexivity. Now, this doesn't mean that we are imagining a collective brain associated with organizations or networks of actors, but we are assuming that when Nelson and I wrote this book together, we did it on purpose. We knew we were doing it on purpose. We knew we were doing it together. So we had a collective aim to create an object. Doesn't mean we share a brain. There's no sort of metaphysical or transcendental kind of implication here. It's just it's the social idea of shared. And lastly, it's focused on social symbolic objects in particular. So we look at particular features of social life, and that's what we're aiming to change. That basic definition is kind of layered on a few different literatures that imply heterogeneous forms of agency, and here we rely primarily on Immerbayer and Misch. The idea that the way it occurs is in programs of action. So most social symbolic work doesn't happen contiguously. So you all work on your professional identities, but not every moment of the day. And so as you work on your professional identities over the course of time, you return to it, you work on your CV, you think about your identity, you meet people, you network, etc. That makes up the program of action that is identity work. And then the last thing is that it depends on and builds on repertoires of practice. There was a question in the chat around the relationship of social symbolic work to practice theory. And we are heavily indebted to practice theory in this work, because what we say is that all work builds on and enacts repertoires of practice. And we mean it very much in the way that Giddens or Nicolini or Shotsky would talk about a practice. Again, so let's return to emotions. So we talked about emotions as objects, and we can think about emotion work then as purposeful, reflexive efforts of individuals, collective actors, and network of actors to shape the expression and experience of emotions. So again, this is people working on their own emotions, people trying to shape the emotions of others, people shaping the experience, but also the display of emotions. Importantly, what it isn't is all of the accidental effects we have on each other's emotions on an ongoing basis. And so I'm in line for a coffee, I trip, I fall on the person in front of me, I knock the coffee out of their hand, they're very angry at me. That was not emotion work. It was, I mean, probably anyway. And so the fact that I occasioned an emotion does not make it emotion work. If the person in front of me was my enemy and I intentionally pushed the coffee out of their hand in order for them to be sad, angry, something, that would be emotion work and coffee work. But that's a different thing. Okay, so one of the early things we did in working through these ideas was we said, okay, let's try and find out what are some different kinds of social symbolic work. And so we sent out an email to the OMT listserv and just asked people for examples of work that they were doing research on, either published or working papers, etc. And we ended up getting about 30 or so instances. We ended up getting more than that, but many of the kinds of work didn't quite fit with what we meant by work. And they didn't have a identifiable object that they were targeting. So here's just a list of a whole bunch of 20 various kinds of work to give you an example. Now, for the book, though, we couldn't really have 20 chapters on 20 different kinds of work. And so we organized it into 3 different ways of thinking about it. And now, just to make clear what this is. So we organize the perspective around self-work, organization, and institutional work. And what these are not are levels. Because if you think about levels, levels of analysis correspond to the actors engaged in work. Individuals, groups of actors, organizations, communities, networks, etc. You could think of as levels of analysis. The objects that they're working on are much less easily thought of as levels, even though there's a kind of uh, analog to levels here with self and organizations. And where it gets complicated is because institutions from within the organization studies tradition are primarily researched at the field level, then there begins to look like this self-organization kind of network or field level, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about different combinations of actors focused on different kinds of objects. And then we organize these in terms of emotion work, identity work, career work for self-work. In organization work, we identified strategy, boundary, and technology work. And for institutional work, practice and category work. And what those right-hand elements are literatures that we identified that are looking at specific kinds of work and specific kinds of objects within management and organizational research broadly. So we're going to return to all of those. Self-work we'll talk about for the second part of today. Organization and institutional work we'll talk about as part of the next couple of days. This is the last structure we want to give you just to kind of organize your thinking around social symbolic work. We use it extensively in the book, mostly to help us organize our understanding of specific literatures to show what we know about, for instance, emotion work, and maybe what's less well known about emotion work or category work and so on. And so what we do in the book is we try and trace through, well, what do we know about the emotions that, or what do we know about the motivations that might drive emotion work, for instance? And what do we know about its effects? And the basic messages in this diagram are really kind of threefold. First of all, it just kind of reiterates the idea that social symbolic work is motivated work. And so it's always possible to trace back in some fashion, and motivations may not be always the best word, but something that is triggering, driving, animating that purposeful reflexive work. Social symbolic work also has effects, but those could be intended or unintended. Those can be a combination of those, and they're really important for a lot of people who study this kind of activity. The effects are really fundamentally important. They don't need to be. You could just be interested in the work and the experience, but a lot of people are interested in social change, and so they tend to look at the effects. Finally, if you think about this diagram as a prompt for research, then you should focus on the arrows rather than the boxes. because in some sense, the arrows are really where the action is. It's not necessarily about creating a list of forms of work and a list of effects. It's about trying to understand the relationship between different forms of work and different effects, or different motivations and different forms of work, and so on. Or asking, one of the things we're really interested in is, what are the resources that are required for different forms of work? And those could be resources as in social capital and cultural capital, but they could also be much more basic resources in terms of material, economic resources, shelter, the ability of people to craft their own lives because they have enough time to do so. So we want to put you back into groups again to think about social symbolic work and start to think about how we would research it. And this, we want you to think of this photograph as data. And what we want you to do is look at this photograph, and we're not going to give you any interpretation of it, and do three things. First of all, have a conversation about what social symbolic objects you observe in this photograph. And then what kinds of social symbolic work do you think are important to constituting the scene here? So we said that all social symbolic objects and social symbolic work exist in social systems. This is a little image of a part of a social system. And so your questions would revolve around that. And then lastly, really almost most importantly, what would be a research question, or maybe two, that you might ask about the objects and the work in this scene? Okay. We're going to again put you into breakout groups, and we're going to give you about 15 minutes to do that. And again, there's a Jamboard, and we'll put the link back in chat again. And there's this slide is there. So again, you don't need to take a picture of it. And then there is an answer page as well. Okay, so we'll see you back in a few minutes. Okay, we'll give people one more minute to come back. How's everyone? All surviving? Thriving?
Comforted. We're comforted.
That was a big smile, Mary. We appreciate it. Rich, I love your background, but I'm pretty sure that's not Fresno.
It's what I wish Fresno looked like, but does not.
It's kind of like what Texas looks like right now.
Who would have thought that I'd be better off in Houston than in Fresno if I want snow?
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you are refreshed. I'm going to share my screen again with you. Again, ask all hard questions in the chat so that Nelson has to answer them. And if you have easy questions, you can just save them for me for later.
Yeah, they've been succeeding in asking many hard questions, Tom, so you'll be happy.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so welcome back. And what we're going to do for the next part of today is discuss self-work. And for us, this was a really interesting and exciting turn in kind of thinking about these forms of work and these kinds of objects when we started to think about how to group them in some way. And the initial aim for the book was really quite modest. I mean, you might say it still is, but it was quite modest in the sense of it was meant to really just kind of categorize and organize these different forms of work and give people a resource that were interested in maybe the intersection or even understanding what kinds of work exist and where they were. And so we just started to think about, well, how would we group these things into ways that made sense, where there are common threads to them. And some of them were relatively easy. And so the ones in the self-work were to some extent easy and some extent not. And so if you take identity, for instance, we talk about identity work as a form of self-work, but it's obviously also a form of organizational work. And you could have identities associated with all kinds of different constellations of actors. And so we simplify by talking in relationship to the self. And that's true across a number of the categories that we put into these overarching themes around self and organization and institutional work. So for instance, boundary work, similarly, you could imagine very easily sitting into a form of self work, into a form of organization work, or a form of institutional work. Where we got to, though, in kind of pushing this direction was helpful because it led us to think a little bit more systematically about the nature of the objects themselves and what we were talking about. And when we started to think about the nature of the self and people's work on the self, we started to think both about the ways in which academic discourse has changed over the last 30, 40 years, and also the way in which the self in non-academic um, life has changed, and not just over the last 40 years, but over a much longer period of time. Because one of the things that really um, became obvious to us when we were looking at the research on this and the writing, both within management and much more broadly, was that these objects that people work on need to be available as objects that are malleable and shapeable, identifiable, understandable as socially constructed in some way before anyone could engage in purposeful action or reflexive action that was meant to shape it in some way, which is really where what led us to move toward um, thinking about what are the histories or kind of archaeologies, if you like, of these different objects, particularly in relationship to the kinds of work that people do on them. And so we start with the self, and we think it's a really useful starting point for bringing in this dynamic understanding of objects and consequently a kind of dynamic understanding of the work that's in that people do. And there were some questions in the chat in the first half of today around things like virtuality and the pandemic and so on. And one thing we are not trying to do is kind of anchor or stop this conversation, because if you believe that these social systems change and the assumptions about objects change, that will continue to unfold over, the future as well as the past. And so things like virtuality may indeed shape how we think of the self, the boundaries of it, what's malleable, what's not, and so on. But let's go back a little ways first and talk about the history of the self and what has led to it being a social symbolic object in the way we recognize it now. If we look at two significant turns in social history, and here we're really talking about Western social history because that's the history we know, and that's the history we write about in the book. We look at Western history, and we look at two significant turns that were really broad societal turns: the turn toward modernity and the turn toward postmodernity as being critical in shaping not just the self, but all of the social symbolic objects that we're going to talk about. Prior to modernity in the West, the conception of a person was really uh, closely aligned and almost synonymous with their role in society. And so for the understanding of work on the self was the fulfillment of a role. And you were mostly born into those roles. There was some movement, obviously, but primarily it was a relatively static set of roles and a relatively static alignment or fulfillment of those roles. And that was as close as we got to doing self-work in that period. The advent of modernity changed things. Um, it led to the conception of the self, and when we talk about modernity, we mean a period, and you can kind of anchor it around early 17th or mid 17th century, if you like. But and depending on where you go and what you're talking about, it's a long transition. But the transition that happened in terms of the self was the movement from accepting an exterior definition of a role toward the self itself becoming a reflexive project that one would work on. And so multiple discourses became available that one would sort of choose, in quotes, choose between, or these become available to you. And the second really significant change was the interiorization. So if you think about the self as a set of behaviors and routines, what happened with modernity was the self became something inside the body as opposed to outside the body, in the mind rather than outside the mind. And so what that meant was that um, instead of behaviors and routines, it became a matter of um, thoughts, feelings, reflections, decisions, beliefs about oneself became the self. This was really kind of most kind of famously captured in Descartes' saying around "I am, I think, therefore I am," which isn't exactly what he said, but it's close enough for our purposes. With the point being that the mind and the body became separate, such that the mind became associated with the self rather than the body. And what that meant was that there was a lot of work suddenly done, and you saw this in popular culture with the advent of things like the novel, but especially things like diaries. And so if we think about diaries now in contemporary times, we think of diaries as something where we put our um, private personal thoughts. Diaries, when they first emerged, were really a tool to work toward becoming a more authentic self, and particularly a more pious self. And so when we look at early diaries, they're often full of kind of verbal self-flagellation for not living up to the expectations of the day, and not necessarily behavioral expectations, but expectations in terms of one's beliefs, one's thoughts, one's attitudes, one's emotions. And so these diaries we see of that time were people trying to work toward a more self-disciplined, and this is where Foucault comes in, a more disciplined, self-controlled understanding of the self. And it's also where authenticity came in. And so authenticity doesn't make a lot of sense if you're thinking about the self as committed to the fulfillment of a social role. Authenticity makes sense when we imagine that the self is bounded to the person and the individual mind. And so we can develop our authentic selves as idiosyncratic to ourselves. And then the 20th century comes along, lots of stuff happens, and sometime around the middle of this 20th century, you can call it post-World War II, particularly in the 1960s and early 1970s, but in that sort of 30-year period, there was an advent of postmodernity. And postmodernity was occasioned significantly by technological change, but also by social change. And what happened to the self in that period was a movement from authenticity in the sense of a single um, autonomous self that you were working to fulfill to a whole network of selves, kind of from instead of one eye and lots of me's, you got lots of eyes, to use the kind of median terminology. Two important things for us happened at in this period. One is that uh, there was a move away from, there was a retainment of change. And so modernity was about change, modernity was about progress. Progress in terms of the self was the move toward an authentic self. Postmodernity retains the emphasis on change and significantly abandons, or at least loosens, the idea of progress, at least toward an individual kind of grand narrative sense of progress like authenticity might suggest. Instead, it suggests a kind of plurality of possible positive directions for the evolution of the self, both across selves and even within the self. So the self becomes plural and evolving in multiple ways simultaneously. At the same time, it becomes quite locally rooted, so that now the self is not about less about authenticity than it is about local progress and local politics. And so when we think about the ways in which the self is adjudicated today, we have lots of local conceptions of what it means for a self to emerge or to evolve. There's a piece here which is interesting where there's a question, and obviously even a social symbolic work perspective kind of depends and significantly on this postmodern turn. Depends on the idea of things being socially constructed and available for people to work on without necessarily there being some transcendental endpoint like authenticity to work toward. So that could mean that anything goes. And so, Nelson and I have over, decades now had conversations with friends who are not interested in social construction, who associate it with the idea, well, if the world is socially constructed, that means just kind of anything goes. And that's not the point. The point is not that anything goes, and the point is not that there's no truth. The point is that there are multiple truths that are locally grounded in local conditions. And this really comes out now. If we think about the changes that have occurred in the Self. So if you think about gender, for instance, and the discourse around gender and the possible transformations that we now either take for granted or grudgingly accept, depending on who you are, around gender and the possible fluidity of gender, the possible kind of articulation of numbers of different kinds of genders, and so on. Those are really kind of fluid and active and a vibrant sort of conversation going on right now. And so one of the things we didn't do, but we could have done and maybe should have done, was ask you to put, for instance, your pronouns into Zoom. So you've probably been on Zoom meetings where we put our pronouns. That just wasn't the case even probably 7 or 8 years ago. And so now that's very different. What we don't do is we don't ask you to put your race on a Zoom call and identify yourself in that way. And because the discussion and the discourse around race is very different than the discourse around gender. And Rachel Dolezal is a very famous person as an instance of the limits of postmodernity and the self and conversations around it. And so if you don't know the story of Rachel Dolezal, she was a college instructor. She was the former National Association for the Advancement of Colored People president of a local chapter. She became famous, beyond those roles, or even really in part because of those roles, when her parents were interviewed and publicly stated that she was a white person passing as Black. This created all kinds of problems. If you don't know the Dolezal story, this created all kinds of problems for Rachel Dolezal. She was reported to the police. The local news media picked it up. And she was described in the local news media both as someone who had falsely passed as Black and also been the victim of race-related hate crimes. Her life became, in some ways, really quite nightmarish. Whether you have sympathy for her or not is another issue. She resigned from the NAACP. She was dismissed from her position as an instructor in African Studies at Eastern Washington University. When she was interviewed in 2015, she said she was born white to white parents, in quotes, but self-identified as Black. This created all kinds of reactions from many communities because there was very strong reactions from some Black communities who accused her of really gross kinds of mistreatment of both Black people and the concept of being a Black person. She was also attacked, maybe is too strong a word, but certainly strongly criticized by transgender groups because there was arguments being made, not really by her, but on her behalf, that there was a kind of equivalence to passing as Black and choosing or at least identifying as a trans woman or a trans man or the question became, are those similar? Are those different? Are those equivalent? Are those not equivalent? From the perspective of one of the interviews in The Guardian, for instance, and I'll get this wrong, I'm sure the quotation, so forgive me if that's the case, but the argument from some transgender activists was that transgender people don't choose a gender, they are born into that gender, and then they come out as that gender. For instance, you come out as a trans man or a trans woman, but being very different than passing as or identifying as Black. So the point here is, I mean, we're not interested in either criticizing or celebrating Rachel Dolezal at all. What we're interested in is the example of this person and their activity showing both the potential and the limitations of self-work at this point in time, at this point in history, in this particular social system. We're going to come back to that as an example and give you a chance to kind of look at that issue around race and self-work in a minute. But first, I want to kind of finish off some of the more conceptual part of this conversation. One of the most systematic parts of the literature on self-work is a tendency to identify self-work as something done by a person on themselves. And this isn't universal by any stretch, but there is a tendency for us to think of identity work as something we do, as emotion work, as the control we express over our own emotions. So um, Ken Gergen, for instance, writes about doing anger. And so we think about doing anger as a form of emotion work, at least to the extent that we do it purposefully and reflexively and so on. But one of the important things we like to point out and want to point out in this relationship of agents to self-work is the idea that focal actors do this work, but so are a whole other set of actors involved, for instance, in self-work, such as emotion work. There are connected individuals, so friends, family, bosses, subordinates, peers will do self-work in relationship to each other. Organizations do self-work, so you could think of socialization, for instance, as a classic kind of self-work done by organizations. And you can imagine, particularly with more extreme forms of socialization, if you think of a military situation or a quasi-military organization and the kinds of socialization that goes on. But you can also imagine for the doctoral students, you probably have a doctoral supervisor. One of the things they're trying to do is turn you into a proper academic. You enter it either an improper academic or unlikely not an academic at all. And one of their jobs is not only to kind of help you learn the business, but help you to become this. And so if you're familiar with the communities of practice literature, for instance, becoming a plumber is learning to be a plumber, not just learning to do plumber work. And the same for academics and their organizations. And then social systems also do much broader, more broadly, they do self-work. So if you think about communities, and if you think about, for instance, religious communities, then those religious communities do lots of work to help instill appropriate values, beliefs, behaviors, but also dress, relationships, such that the members of those religious communities become appropriate and proper selves. And I pick on religious communities only because they provide a kind of more obvious example of that. Obviously, lots and lots of different kind of communities do that same work. Just a couple of examples. We've talked about emotion work already. I'm going to skip over that. One of the, I think, really interesting possible kinds of work that people have not looked at very much, which is really ironic in a way, given that we work in business schools, most of us, is the idea of career work. And there was a couple of you who identified that as primarily interested in career work, which is fantastic. I think careers as social symbolic objects are a really profoundly important and understudied phenomenon from this perspective. The literature on careers has really predominantly looked at careers as simple histories of the evolution of a person's jobs, work, and so on. And what it's not tended to look at is how people construct the career as an object itself. And if you think about, again, if you think about academic life, we do a lot of work constructing not only the steps and stages of our career, getting a job, etc., but making sense of, telling the story of our careers, trying to understand our careers in terms of who we are. And this becomes especially important. A number of you made comments in the chat around things like the gig economy, side hustles, boundaryless careers. This is where people do even more, or at least more obvious forms of career work. If you think of it, conceptualizing it as self-work, so what? What does that mean? Well, one of the things it does is embed careers in a much broader network of social symbolic objects and social symbolic work than you might normally think of it as embedded in. So for instance, you would embed career work in relationship to families, organizations, technologies. You would embed it in relationship to emotions and identities. All of these different objects would be kind of in play, motivating, but also informing and shaping the career work you might do. Okay, so I want to give you a chance to talk about self-work now, and I want to give you an opportunity to do so in relationship to an example that's not that far away from the Rachel Dolezal article. This is an article from The Guardian who talks about Jessica Krug. And this is about one of us, in a sense, a university canceling classes by a white academic who posed as Black. And those are obviously The Guardian's words, not my words, in terms of posing and so on. What we're going to do is break you out into rooms with 3 other participants. And what we want to focus on is not so much the research question this time, but 2 questions. One is, what forms of self-work can you identify in the reading, and what actors are engaging in the self-work? So again, you go back a couple of slides, and our point is that Jessica Krug is not the only person doing self-work in this story. The second question is, what is this question, or what questions does this case raise about the moral and ethical limits? And limits might be the wrong word, but the moral and ethical dimensions, qualities, characteristics, dynamics of self-work. And so what questions does it raise for you about the ethics and the morality of self-work? And again, on the Jamboard, you'll see there's space for both of those. We're going to give you 20 minutes to do so, then we're going to come back and talk about that. Any questions or anything before that, Nelson, that we should be addressing?
No, there's been an interesting conversation going on, people sharing things on the chat, but there hasn't been particular questions that we need to talk about. So please go ahead with the exercise, I think.
Great. Okay, so we'll see you back in 20 minutes then.